When we're dealing with security, the authentication question answers who are you. But once we've figured out who the person is, typically with a username and password or some kind of credentials maybe that come from a third party, the next question we have to answer is one of authorization. Authorization asks the question, what do you have access to? So now that we know who you are, where can you go? What can you do? For instance, you might have an application where you allowed any users to examine your data, but you might only want administrators to actually be able to delete data or edit data or add new data. And so you might have an authenticated user, but not all users are going to be authorized to make changes to the data. So you see the difference? Authentication is figuring out who you are. Authorization is figuring out, now that we know who you are, what are we actually going to let you do? Well, in MVC4, the most common way that we do authorization is with the authorize attribute. Now, if you know MVC4 authentication, you know that this is the attribute we use for authentication as well. It's the attribute we use to prohibit access to areas, controller methods, or entire controllers when the user is not authenticated. If that authorize attribute is there, they can't get in. We'll prompt them for a login. Well, when you use the authorize attribute, you can also pass it a parameter to specify who you want to let in based on their role, if you will. One of the things we can do in the authorize attribute is specify a list of users. So if you have a particular controller action perhaps, or an admin section, and you only want one or two specific users to use it, you can specify those usernames in your authorize attribute, and it will limit access to just those specific usernames. This is not very common, however, mostly because most web applications will have dozens, maybe hundreds, perhaps even thousands of users. The much larger, more popular ones, of course, are going to have many, many, many more than that, and so it's just not practical to list specific usernames for each area that you want to control. You can do that, and in smaller applications or for smaller organizations, that might be just fine, and then you can avoid the whole complicated role management aspect. But what is more common is to use the authorize attribute to specify certain roles that have access to that method or that controller. So in your authorize attribute, you set roles equal to and then a comma delimited list of roles that you want to have access to that method. So this is pretty important because if you've just used authorize in an authentication sense, then you've used it to differentiate between, say, logged in users and users that are not logged in. But by using a list of users or a list of roles, we're taking it one step further. We already assume you're logged in or you wouldn't even be here, and now we're finding out, even though you're logged in, do you have access to this particular action or this particular controller? And so it will take your user profile and try to match it against the list of users or against the list of roles. Roles are pretty great, however they do add a little bit of complexity because you actually have to assign roles to people. And the way you do this is going to be somewhat different depending on what kind of authentication mechanism you like to use. So if you're using simple membership, for instance, which is what MVC4 uses by default, there's a very simple mechanism we use for assigning roles, but you still have to do it. You actually have to, either in the code or in the database, assign users to the specific roles you want them to have. If you're using something like, say, regular forms authentication, then when you are authenticating the user, you're going to need to add roles to that collection and make sure those roles get saved in the forms authentication cookie. If you're using Windows authentication, then you're going to have access to the roles they have in your network. So if a person is, say, in the developer role on your Active Directory network, then what's going to happen is if you use Windows authentication, it's automatically going to know that it's going to be in that group, and the attributes will work right out of the box. It seems easy, but the thing is, you can really only use that for internal applications, because obviously if you put something on the internet, you're not going to want to add all those users to your Windows network. So when it comes to dealing with authorization, Role-based authorization is probably the most common by a long shot, but just remember that you are going to have to supply some code for this. MVC4 does not know what roles you want to use, nor does it know what roles you want to give access to for specific pieces of functionality, so you will have to code that yourself. To explore this concept of authorization a little bit, I wanted to demonstrate the way we use the authorize attribute to control authorization. So you'll notice here in this controller I've got an authorize attribute here at the top, which means that none of these methods can be called if the user is not authenticated. Now, I haven't set any permissions or role-based or anything with this attribute. It just basically says keep out everybody who isn't logged in. If you are logged in, you should be able to get to the index just fine. However, on this very secure action, I put in an authorize attribute that specified that the roles has to equal administrator. Okay, so whatever user tries to hit that action, they need to have administrator somewhere in their collection of roles. Now, this isn't a magic word. We could call our roles, anything we wanted to, depending on what you wanted your roles to be. But, administrator is obviously a very common role, but it's just a string. So it matches up with whatever roles you want to use. So if I actually try this out, just so you can see that it works. So I have this link to members only. I am not logged in. So when I click members only, it does not let me into that view. It's forcing me to log in. So I'm going to test user and password. Okay. Looks like the validation is working. Let me try sample user. Yeah, that works out. Okay, so now I am logged in as sample user. So when I go to members only, it lets me in just fine. This is the home page of the members only section because I'm authenticated. But what about authorization? If I hit go to our secure page, it's making me log in again, logging in with a different account because sample user is not an administrator. Okay, so that's the way that works. So how does one become an administrator? Okay. Now, one thing we could do is we could go to the database directly and actually modify the values in the tables. So for instance, if I take a look at the SQL Server Object Explorer over here, and that's just under the View menu. You can also use Server Explorer to do the same thing. I come down here to Databases. Here's the database that it created for me, the Authorization Lab. Okay, and you will notice that I've got this user profile table, and I've got the membership table and OAuth membership table. I have this roles table, and I also have users and roles. So what I can actually do here in the database is I could add the administrator role to this table, and I could add the user ID and the role ID here to assign that user to the role. His ID is going to be over here in the user profile column. So I could look for sample user, get his ID, come down here and add the role administrator, get that role ID, add that combination of keys here in this table, and boom, they're in. So if you do things from more of a database perspective, that's one way you can do it. However, it's more common for people to make some sort of back office page or some kind of administrative tool that allows them to manage their users and roles. So I made a very low budget, no frills version of this, just so you could kind of see how it works. Okay, so I made a roles controller mostly because I really wanted to use a role model for the model. So what this view does, let me pull it up for you real quick, is it's just a simple form that says, to which user would you like to grant admin privileges? You type in a username, you hit submit. That comes through here, and what I do is I say, if not web security user exists model.username, then go back to the view. In other words, the simple membership didn't find them, so there's no need to change their role, they don't exist. The next thing I do is I see if the administrator role doesn't exist, go ahead and create it. This is just a little syntactical sugar that's offered to me right out of the box with simple membership that will create that entry in the database table for me. So basically I'm saying if this isn't already in the database as a role, add it as a role. This next part is I take the username and I get roles for user, which gives me a list of their roles, and I see if it contains administrator, because if they're an administrator already, I don't need to add them again. If it doesn't, then I'm going to add users to roles, the username, and administrator. Now there's a lot of magic strings here. Probably what I would want to do is use a constant for this role name and use that everywhere so I don't accidentally do something like this and mess up the entire logic chain. But at least you can kind of see what's going on. Does the user exist? If so, does this role exist in the database? If not, create it. If the user's role does not already contain administrator, then add this role to this user, the administrator role, and then go back to the view. Okay, so you remember sample user is not an administrator. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to go to that roles manager. Okay. Looks like I forgot a little bit of code there for using my form. This is another good reason to sometimes let MVC auto-generate a little bit of the code for you. So hopefully that'll clear us up here. There we go. Okay, so the user I want to add admin privileges to is sample user. Okay, so now when I log in as sample user, okay, I'm logged in. I go to members only. I should be able to get there, okay, because I'm logged in. Now when I hit go to our secure page, I'm in. Very secure. This is an inner page of the members only section. So sample user has obviously been added to the administrator role, and the authorize attribute that keeps people out is obviously working. And it allows people in with a role of administrator.